Hello and welcome, my name's Greg and we're going to discuss kind of the news topics, the headlines in terms of financial news. So let's just get straight into it. So a few days ago, the Treasury put out a video of Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, explaining inflation and why it's so high. He starts off the video by stating that the average coffee about a year ago was £2.56 and it has now gone up to £2.86. That analogy was chosen for a specific reason because it represents a 12% rise in the value in 1 year. Because what's funny about this is the fact that the CPI has actually reached over 9.2% year over year for December, which is coincidentally similar to the 12% rise in the coffee price. However, we all know that inflation is not actually 9.2%. We can see going to the shops, filling up fuel, it's much more than 12% or 9%. Because in reality, if we compare the figures for the price of things such as shopping, it's more in line with the RPI, which is the retail price index, instead of the CPI, which is used by the government. The most recent RPI stands at 19.3% increase year over year, which actually is a more accurate measurement of inflation. And if we're going to compare inflation to historical standards, the RPI was used back in the 70s and 80s, in which people are comparing inflation to. The CPI wasn't even introduced in the UK until December of 2003. When we're comparing inflation historically, a more accurate representation is the RPI. You see, the reason the CPI generates a lower figure every month compared to the RPI is because when doing the CPI in this calculation of the basket of goods, they do consider changes in substitutions, whereas the RPI does not. For example, if steak went up by 0.2% in 1 month, they would be far more likely to substitute that for, say, something such as chicken, which didn't rise as much. The justification for these adjustments is because they say, let's say chicken is a substitute for steak, and consumers will swap them due to the change in price of steak. But the result of this is it artificially lowers the CPI value, the actual overall inflation figure. Whereas in the RPI, you don't get those substitutions and it gives you the raw increase in these figures, which is why the RPI is more accurate, and it has been throughout the 70s and 80s. So when they're comparing figures, oh, this is the highest inflation in 40 years, it's beyond that. Those figures were using the RPI, whereas now they're using a completely different system which artificially lowers the inflation number. In the video, Jeremy Hunt also states that inflation has hit shopping baskets by a rise of 16%, when we all know it's actually a lot higher than that. You know what's hilarious about this video in which Jeremy Hunt describes and uses the excuse, the scapegoat of COVID and the supply chains. No, that was temporary. That was, as the Fed and the Bank of England, all the central banks were saying, was transitory inflation. Remember that? Because of the supply chains. It's been 2 years, 3 years in fact. It's been 3 years since the COVID lockdowns, and they're still saying it's because of the supply chains. And once again, he uses the scapegoat of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, when in fact we know that gas prices were going up before the invasion. It maybe it attributed to the increase in gas prices, but they were going up regardless. The notion that the inflation is caused by the supply chains and Putin's invasion of Ukraine is ridiculous. Because there's two things he failed to mention. The real reason for inflation is, number one, all that money that was printed during COVID lockdowns. The money, the free money and the loans that were, the so-called loans anyway, that were given out to businesses. And also the second biggest thing being all of the QE since 2008. All of that loose money is now biting them in the rear end. It's quite convenient how he failed to mention the fact that the Bank of England has been printing money since 2008. I was looking on social media and the responses to the video. Many stated that Brexit had attributed to the inflation that we're seeing. That is just balderdash. Inflation is happening to everyone across the world. And anyone that claims that Brexit had anything to do with the inflation clearly doesn't understand economics. You see, if we want to talk about Brexit rationally and the impact it has, the real response to Brexit will be seen in 5 or 10 or 15 years from now. That's the real time to evaluate Brexit, not now, because the benefits come long term, not in the short term. And what I mean by that is we need to see what trade deals come to light. Obviously, we've had a few, but it's not immediate and we need more progress in terms of trade deals, which takes time. It's not done overnight. It's going to take many years. And we can then evaluate it in the future. The problem is it's been too soon since Brexit to really evaluate its impact long term. Of course, in the short term, there are going to be some shocks, and there have been shocks in the economy from Brexit. And just a side note, I was seeing some reports about comments Andrew Bailey made recently. He stated that Brexit reforms could have an impact on the economy. But let's not forget, this is the same man that said inflation is going to be transitory, and inflation, there is no concern with inflation. Andrew Bailey stated in 2021 that inflation would not occur and the money printing that happened during COVID would have no impact on the price of items. And if there was, it would be short-term shocks as a result of supply chains. Nothing to do with the QE. I mean, what an absolute fool. I am sorry. The fact that he still works at the Bank of England and has the pride to still go to work after stating that. And it's the same with Jerome Powell at the Federal Reserve. They have the balls to go to the office every single day, knowing how wrong they would be. They're either lying or they're just so bad at their jobs, I can't tell. This ties in nicely with the next story. Relating to Andrew Bailey, he also made other comments relating to Lizz Truss. Now, this is a whole other thing with Lizz Truss. I mean, when she was appointed the leader of the Conservative Party and then therefore the new Prime Minister, the premise of her ideology was to revoke a sense of nostalgia in the form of Margaret Thatcher in order to popularise herself amongst Conservatives, which, in my opinion, she didn't really. And I tend to disagree with a lot of Conservatives. I believe that she actually was not a Thatcherite in much of her actual ideology in terms of economics. Her economics principles were actually complete. They were Thatcherite type policies. However, Margaret Thatcher, knowing her ideology of economics, she would not have borrowed the amount of money that we're borrowing right now and the amount of money Liz Truss wanted to borrow, simply because throughout the entire 80s, Margaret Thatcher didn't have to contend with massive amounts of QE and a national debt over £2.5 trillion. In fact, under Margaret Thatcher, in the 11 and a half years, the debt increased by just over £1 billion. See, the main economic principle that Margaret Thatcher always reinforced was the idea of spending within your means. Liz Truss did not want to spend within the government's means. That was a vital part of her ideology. Liz Truss's plans attempted to essentially spend more and borrow more in order to, quote, grow the pie, which was Margaret Thatcher did do that. However, she did not monetize the debt. She kept taxes low. It's funny how certain conservatives' memory fits a certain narrative, because what they fail to remember is the fact that during Thatcher's initial budget in 1979, she raised VAT, the value-added tax, which is considered a very regressive form of taxation, was increased from 8% to 15%. When Thatcher spent money, it was with taxpayers' money, not borrowed money. Anyway, I digress. Getting back to Andrew Bailey. God, that man, I don't know how he has his job. He's what is it, £600,000 a year he makes. He doesn't understand a thing, it seems like. I don't know, he's the head at the Bank of England, the governor. How? What a fool. There's reports that he wants to start to cut down interest rates, or at least stop hikes, as in raising interest rates. He thinks that somehow inflation has peaked because of the recent drop in inflation. I say drop, it's a smidge lower, that's all. I mean, does the man not know how it works? In order to sufficiently reduce inflation, what he has to do is get interest rates in terms of real terms positive. Currently, they are negative. Interest rates are what? Is it 3.3%? 3.25%? And he thinks inflation that's running at almost 10%, he thinks because he's behind the curve still, that's sufficient. Massively behind the curve. No, he needs to get ahead of the curve. That yield curve is so important in terms of lowering inflation. Is a pure clown. Fools. The only one that I somewhat sort of admire, for being honest, is Mervyn King. But he was the one that started all that QE anyway. But of course he didn't say it at the time. It's only now that he's not governor he's able to say, oh well, you know, maybe it was a mistake and all this QE's bad, and the governors now, it's their fault that we're in this mess, the current governors, when, you know, he should be taking responsibility. But at least he has the cojones to admit that it was a mistake.